right there in the sterile, white hospital room, thick with the smell of antiseptic. The pregnant woman didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, a container of hot porridge still steaming in her hand. And then, she flung it straight onto her mother-in-law lying paralyzed on the bed. The porridge splattered everywhere, across a face too old to fight back, into strands of gray hair, across the white blanket, once clean, now stained. No one moved fast enough to stop it. No one even understood what had just happened. The only sound was the dry clatter of the plastic container hitting the floor. The woman looked down, not a trace of hesitation in her eyes. And she said, "You don't deserve to be taken care of." But what she didn't know was that the woman lying there was not as powerless as she seemed. And what she understood even less is that some people, even when they can't stand, still have the power to bring your entire world down. Because in this life, the most dangerous mistake is not doing something wrong. It's underestimating the wrong person. And the moment she threw that container, she didn't just hurt someone. She began destroying her own future. If you think this is just a story about cruelty, keep listening, because the truth behind it will change the way you treat people. Where are you watching from? Drop your country or city in the comments below, because this story is being heard all around the world. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might change how you see life forever. Her name was Mama Ifunanya. There was a time when just hearing that name in a room was enough to change the atmosphere. Not because she raised her voice, not because she needed anyone to fear her, but because in Lagos, there are people who need to speak loudly for others to listen. Mama Ifunanya used to be one of them. Wherever she walked, the room would quiet itself. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Eyes turned toward her not out of curiosity, but out of respect. People used to say she had the kind of eyes that could read a person in seconds. One glance was enough to know who was telling the truth, who was wearing a mask, who entered her life with gratitude, and who came only to take something away. Back then, she wore traditional fabrics tailored from the finest materials, thin gold bracelets resting on her wrists, her steps slow yet steady. She never needed to prove who she was. The entire city had already done that for her long ago. But life has turned so cruel that even those who once stood at the highest point can be pushed into silence before they understand what happened. The stroke came on an ordinary morning. No thunder, no dramatic collapse, just a body that had once been strong, once in control of an entire life, suddenly betraying its owner. Half her body stopped responding. Her speech slurred into fragments. The hand that once signed decisions others waited for now lay still on a white hospital sheet. The legs that once walked through grand halls, beautiful homes, corridors where people stood when she passed now rested motionless, as if they had never belonged to her at all. But the most painful part was not the illness. It was what the illness revealed. Because when a person is strong, they rarely see how much of the love around them is real. Only when they become weak, when they can no longer offer benefits, no longer open doors, no longer provide shelter or protection, do they begin to see who stays out of love and who had already left long ago, unnoticed. In the first days at the hospital, there were still a few calls, a few bouquets delivered, a few carefully worded messages, full of polite concern. "We are praying for you. May God grant you a speedy recovery. The whole family is worried." But prayers over the phone are easy. They don't change bandages. They don't clean a body. They don't sit for hours in the smell of medicine, the beeping of monitors, and that heavy silence that only exists in rooms where time feels uncertain. Flowers wither, messages stop, calls grow fewer. After a few weeks, the hallway outside her room became so quiet. You could hear a stretcher rolling from the far end of the ward. No visitors, no old friends, no business partners, none of the faces that once smiled brightly at her parties. Not even the relatives who had built their lives on her generosity. The world that once revolved around her didn't disappear with a loud crash. It dissolved like mist, coldly, cruelly. In the end, on a visitation schedule nearly empty, only one name remained. Zainab Bello, her daughter-in-law. Every day, almost at the same hour, she stepped into the hospital room, with the scent of expensive perfume arriving before she did. The sharp click of her high heels echoed against the tiled floor too loud for a place meant for endurance and prayer. She was always perfectly dressed, form-fitting dresses, sleek hair, flawless makeup, a face so beautiful that outsiders could easily mistake her for devotion itself. The nurses sometimes looked at her with initial approval. A young daughter-in-law, a pregnant woman, visiting every day. On the surface, it looked like duty. But there are things you only notice if you stay long enough in a room. Zainab didn't come out of love. She came because she had to. There was always an invisible distance between her and the chair beside the bed, as if even when she sat down, she was never truly there. She stood more than she sat, and when she did sit, her body angled toward the door, like someone waiting to be released from a place she never wanted to belong. She rarely touched her mother-in-law except when it was absolutely unavoidable. Every movement was brief, controlled, tolerant. She adjusted the blanket, not because she feared the old woman was cold, but because she could stand it being uneven. She placed a glass of water on the table, not because she sensed thirst, but because a nurse had reminded her. She asked a few questions the way people recite scripted politeness. "How are you feeling today? Did the doctor say anything? Do you need anything?" But even a child could tell. Some questions are never meant to be answered, and the most painful truth was that Mama Ifunanya knew all of it. Though her mouth could no longer form full sentences, though half her body lay still as stone, her mind remained painfully clear. She saw every impatient glance Zainab gave when the nurses turned her body. She noticed the faint wrinkle of disgust when the smell of ointment lingered. She saw the moment her daughter-in-law checked her lipstick in the dark reflection of the turned-off television right beside the bed, where she lay, helpless. No one knows what it feels like to lie there for hours, hearing others speak about you, as if you were something slowly deteriorating. She needs a change of medication. She's weaker today. She may not recover. She was there, hearing everything, understanding everything, but not fast enough, not strong enough, not clear enough to interrupt and reclaim her dignity. Zainab never hit her, never shouted at her in front of doctors, never did anything dramatic enough for outsiders to immediately judge. Her cruelty was more refined than that. It lived in the sigh she let out when signing another hospital bill, in the way she wiped a drop of porridge from the blanket like cleaning up a nuisance, in a sentence that sounded harmless but cold as steel. "You have to try harder. Everyone is busy. Everyone, not family, not us. Everyone." A word distant enough to push a mother out of the very home she once built. In Zainab's eyes, Mama Ifunanya was no longer the woman Lagos once spoke of with reverence, no longer the name that opened doors for an entire family, no longer the woman who raised the man she now called her husband. She had become a burden wrapped in white sheets, attached to Eveline's consuming time, money, attention, and the life Zainab believed she deserved. To Zainab, a person's worth seemed measured by what they could still do for others. If you were strong, powerful, influential, you deserved respect. If you lay still, spoke slowly, needed to be fed, you were excess. She did say it every day, but she lived as if it were true, and that silence was the most dangerous part, because some poisons don't kill instantly. They drip slowly into a person's dignity, day after day. Outside the hospital window, Lagos roared on as if no tragedy existed in that room. The city still lit up at night. Cars stretched endlessly across the roads. Parties continued. Laughter echoed through luxury buildings. People dressed well, signed contracts, raised glasses, and called the names of those who still mattered. Inside this room, a woman once respected by an entire city was learning how to exist as a shadow. And a young, beautiful woman, the supposed future of the family, was revealing the most dangerous thing within her. Not anger, not violence, but the ability to look at someone in pain and no longer see them as human. That is how real tragedies begin, not with shouting, but with a heart that quietly turns cold. And in that hospital room, so silent it almost felt empty, fate had already begun to move. Slowly, silently, unnoticed, but enough to prepare for a moment that everyone who'd one day witness it would never forget. Zainab below lived in a world built of glass, light and compliments. Everything around her had to be beautiful, beautiful on purpose, beautiful enough that anyone looking in would believe her life had never touched a dark corner. From the penthouse overlooking Lagos, glowing every night, to custom-tailored dresses, to dinners in restaurants where people greeted her with respectful smiles, everything in Zainab's life was arranged to send a clear message to the world. She belonged at the top, the kind of woman who walked into a room and drew every eye without trying, the kind of person whose silence alone felt important, and Zainab loved that feeling. She loved the way doors were opened for her, loved the way other women subtly glanced at her pregnant belly, then at the ring on her finger as if quietly acknowledging that she had everything: a successful husband, a child on the way, a rising social status, a future that seemed untouchable. That husband was Adewale Okoye, young, composed, intelligent, and rising so fast that people his age both admired and envied him. At social gatherings, when his name came up, voices often lowered just slightly, not out of fear, but out of respect for the kind of presence forming around a man who clearly knew where he was going. Adewale wasn't he loud. He didn't he need attention. It was his control that made him stand out. He moved like someone accustomed to expectations, spoke like someone who understood the weight of every word, worked like every closed door in front of him was simply a matter of time before it opened. And in Zainab's eyes, that success belonged entirely to him. It was the result of intelligence, discipline, and well-placed ambition. She believed that so completely it became an unquestioned truth. She watched her husband in perfectly tailored suits, in long boardroom calls, in early mornings and late nights, and she thought, this is a man who built his own destiny. A man who needed no backing, no old name from the past, no family safety net, no legacy from a mother lying helpless in a hospital bed. That was what Zainab believed, not once, but every single day. She believed it so deeply that any other truth would feel like an insult to the world she lived in. Even her mother-in-law's past felt irrelevant. Mama Ifunanya, in Zainab's mind, belonged to a closed chapter. Maybe she used to be someone. Maybe she once commanded silence in a room. Maybe she once held power, money, respect. But used to be was a phrase Zainab didn't respect. She worshipped the present, worshipped what was useful, worshipped what still held value. A woman lying motionless in a hospital bed, speaking with difficulty, unable to move, needing to be fed spoon by spoon, needing nurses to adjust her blanket, in Zainab's cold framework, was no longer the center of anything. She was what remained, a shadow of a finished era, an obligation life forced Zainab to step through each day. And that's where her arrogance began to grow in its most dangerous form. Not through shouting, but through the belief that she understood the true nature of things. At first, her visits to the hospital were just tiring. A slight frown when the elevator moved too slowly, a quiet sigh while signing another document, a quick glance down long corridors where the smell of antiseptic clung to the air like a reminder that this place had no room for glamour. Then exhaustion turned into irritation. Zainab hated the smell, hated the cold, sterile indifference of white walls, hated the steady beeping of heart monitors like a song that never ends, hated the soft shuffle of nurses' footsteps, hated distant coughing echoing from other rooms, hated the way her beauty felt almost out of place here. Here, designer clothes meant nothing. Jewelry meant nothing. Expensive perfume couldn't overpower the scent of alcohol, medicine, and human vulnerability. She hated that. because the hospital reminded her that there were things money could not make beautiful. And Zainab didn't like being reminded of anything beyond her control. But what bothered her most was not the hallway, not the smell, not the silence. It was the woman lying in that bed. Mama Ifunanya never begged, never caused a scene. Some days, she simply lay there, eyes open, breathing heavy, as if she had already accepted living inside a body that no longer obeyed her. And yet that quiet presence unsettled Zainab more than any accusation could, because some people, even when they can no longer stand, still carry a dignity that disturbs others. Mama Ifunanya had that kind of gaze. Whenever Zainab entered the room, the older woman would slowly turn her head, her eyes following her not with anger, not with pleading, not with pity, just watching. And that look made Zainab impatient. It made her feel judged, as if the woman lying there, unable to speak, could still see through the makeup, through the polite tone, through every performative gesture, as if she knew everything, knew that Zainab came only because her husband expected it, knew that every minute beside that bed carried a single, cold thought. When will this finally be over? The first time that thought appeared, Zainab startled herself, not because it felt cruel, but because it felt easy. It came naturally like a reflex, as if, deep down, her mother-in-law had already stopped being a full human being and had become nothing more than an uncomfortable phase to pass through before life returned to its polished trajectory. She never said it out loud, but the discomfort kept building. Every time she saw a nurse feeding spoon by spoon, she felt irritated. Every time a doctor said more time, more medication, more monitoring, she felt suffocated. Every time Adewale gently asked about his mother, calm and responsible, something irrational stirred inside her, because she didn't understand why he still showed tenderness, why he still saw caring for his mother as natural, why a man rising so fast would allow part of his life to remain anchored in this cold hospital room. So Zainab began telling herself a different story, that she was the practical one, that reality had to be faced, that life couldn't pause for someone who no longer contributed, that the child in her womb was the real future, that her husband needed to look forward, that the world they were building couldn't be held back by a body lying still on a hospital bed. And when a person begins to justify their coldness with logic that sounds reasonable, that's when they become most dangerous, because cruelty no longer looks like anger. It dresses itself as reason. It speaks calmly. It convinces you that you are not wrong, just more realistic than others. And Zainab had reached that point. Each day she walked into the hospital, her patience thinned a little more. Each day she stood by that bed, her respect faded a little more. Each day she looked at her motionless mother-in-law, she became more certain that the woman had nothing to do with this family's future. What she didn't know was that this belief was her greatest mistake, because in truly powerful families, in deeply rooted legacies, in lives that seem to have faded into the background, there are people who no longer need to appear, yet their influence has never disappeared. But arrogance has a predictable habit. It blinds people just before life corrects them. And while Zainab adjusted her dress, walked through hospital corridors with a cold expression, carrying the quiet certainty that the future was entirely in her hands, fate was already standing at the end of her path, waiting, not rushing, not speaking, just waiting for the exact moment to turn her contempt into a mistake she could never undo. That day, the Lagos sky was a dull gray, as if the city had forgotten how to welcome light. No rain, no sun, just a heavy layer of air pressing down on everything from the glass buildings downtown to the cold, white hospital corridor where Mama Ifunanya had been lying for so long that people were beginning to grow used to her silent presence. Zainab stepped out of the car slowly, one hand resting on her stomach, the other holding a container of hot porridge she had picked up in a hurry on the way there. Heat rose through the lid and into her fingers, but what burned hotter in that moment was the irritation. that had been building in her chest for days. She did not want to be there, did not want to breathe in that dry antiseptic smell that clung to her hair, her clothes, even her mood. Did not want to look at the exhausted faces in the hallway, the lowered eyes, the shoulders bent under the weight of illness and waiting. And more than anything, she did not want to walk into that room, the room where a motionless woman still managed to make her feel as though she were the one being seen through. The click of Zainab's heels against the tile sounded sharp and cold. The nurses knew her face well enough by then that they only looked up with tired greetings before returning to work. No one knew that today was different. No one knew that beneath the flawless makeup, the fitted dress, and the polished appearance of a successful wife, something inside her had worn down to its most dangerous point. No patience left, no more pretending, no more desire to play the role of the dutiful daughter-in-law. She pushed open the door. It opened softly. The room was the same as always, too clean, too quiet, too white. The light coming through the window was dim, spreading a pale wash across the bed. The heart monitor continued its steady rhythm, one beep at a time, as though nothing in the world could force it to change. The IV bag hung beside the bed, clear fluid dripping slowly. And at the center of all that silence, Mama Ifunanya lay there. Her eyes were open. She barely blinked. She did not move. Half her face was almost still, but her eyes still held that remaining light, the kind that kept others from daring to underestimate her. It had been weakened by illness, but it had never truly disappeared. At the sound of the door, she turned to look. Slowly, very slowly, her eyes stopped on Zainab, then lowered to the container of porridge in her hand, as if she had already guessed that this was just another reluctant ritual, another meal, another visit, another obligation to complete before returning to real life. Zainab closed the door behind her. No greeting, no smile. She set her handbag on the chair, tugged lightly at her sleeve, and stood looking at the woman on the bed with an expression that, had anyone truly seen it, they would have recognized as something beyond ordinary annoyance. It was disgust. Disgust that had been fed for too long in silence. A young nurse was adjusting paperwork at the far end of the room. She looked up at Zainab and offered a polite smile. "Mayam, she's been awake for a little while. Maybe she'll eat a bit better today." Zainab did not answer right away. She only gave a small nod, just enough to cut off any further conversation. The nurse's polite smile faded. She lowered her head and continued writing. Still there, still present, an accidental witness no one had noticed yet. Zainab walked to the bedside, one step at a time. The container of porridge remained steady in her hand. Steam rose from it, carrying the smell of overcooked rice, and bland minced meat, the smell of minimal care, of food made for the sick, of a life reduced to a few difficult spoonfuls. She stopped beside the bed. From that close, she could see every mark illness had left on her mother-in-law. The thinning skin, the deepened lines, the gray hair flattened against the pillow, the dry lips, the hand resting on the blanket so lightly it seemed to have no weight at all. And suddenly, instead of pity, Zainab felt a shapeless anger rise in her chest. Anger at that silence. Anger that her days kept being dragged back to this room. Anger that her husband, despite his meetings and ambitions, still reserved a portion of unchanging tenderness for the woman lying paralyzed in that bed. Anger that she was still there, still existing like a shadow too large to disappear, even though her body had nearly given up. Zainab leaned down. The steam from the porridge mixed with her perfume, creating a tension in the air that felt almost unbearable. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but as cold as metal pulled from ice water. "Do you really think you still matter?" Mama Ifunanya did not move. Only her eyes stayed on Zainab. No hatred, no pleading. Just that gaze. And it was precisely that calm helplessness that lit the fuse. Zainab clenched her jaw. The faintest smile touched her lips, not the smile of joy, but the smile of someone who had finally decided not to restrain herself anymore. You think people are supposed to keep revolving around you. She continued, each word falling like ice. You think just because you used to be somebody, the whole world is supposed to stop for you. In the corner of the room, the nurse's pen had stopped moving. The silence became so dense that even the hum of the air conditioner overhead sounded loud. Zainab tilted her head slightly, looking at her mother-in-law the way one looks at an old secret, no longer worth protecting. No one needs you anymore. 1 second. Just one. The world seemed to freeze between the electronic heartbeat and the rising steam from the porridge. Then Zainab swung her hand. Not wildly, like someone losing control in a fit of rage, but decisively, precisely, as if she had replayed the motion in her mind too many times before finally doing it. The container tipped. The hot porridge burst from its opening in a short arc through the air. Time narrowed. Everything happened in less than the span of a blink, but for the people inside that room, that moment would later stretch in memory like slow motion, impossible to erase. The porridge hit Mama Ifuniani's face first, then her hair, her neck, the thin hospital gown, the cruelly clean white blanket. Some splashed onto the pillow, some slid from her chin, tracing a thin line through the crease beside her cheek. And there was one drop, only one, that slowly rolled down from the corner of her eye. It looked like a tear, but no one could tell whether it was porridge or something more painful than that. The nurse gasped. The chart in her hands nearly fell to the floor. My am. The cry came too late, too small, too weak against what had just happened. Mama Efunanya did not scream. She could not. Her body only jerked very slightly, a delayed, painful, nearly powerless reaction from someone being attacked with no way to protect herself. Her breathing tightened. Her eyes widened. Not with surprise, as if some part of her had long sensed that life would eventually bring her to a humiliation like this, but from the heat and the shock, cutting through the last intact layer of her dignity. The room suddenly felt too small for the terrible silence swelling inside it. The heart monitor began to speed up. Beep, beep, faster now, sharper. The nurse rushed forward. Oh my God. She grabbed a towel from the cart, her hands shaking so badly she dropped one onto the floor. Another nurse in the hallway heard the commotion, pushed open the door, and froze in the doorway when she saw the old woman's face, gown, and blanket covered in porridge. No one could form a full sentence. No one could understand how a pregnant woman in elegant clothes and spotless heels could stand in the middle of that hospital room, as if what she had just thrown was not food, but another human being's dignity. And Zainab straightened. The empty container was still in her hand, suddenly weightless. Her face was not twisted with rage, not flushed with shame. That was the most frightening part. She was calm. Calm like someone who had just brushed an inconvenience out of the way. Her eyes moved over the two nurses, scrambling to wipe Mama Ifunania's face, over the porridge spreading across the white blanket, over the shrill warning of the monitor, and then rested for a brief moment on her mother-in-law. Just a moment, but long enough to see that there was no weakness left in the old woman's eyes. There was something else. Not revenge, not pleading, but the pain of someone who had finally seen, without doubt, the true nature of the person standing in front of her. That should have made Zainab hesitate. But arrogance, once it has gone too far, no longer gives people the chance to stop in time. She placed the empty container on the table beside the bed with a dry, hollow knock. Then she turned away. No apology, no explanation. Not even the smallest flicker of panic from someone who had just realized she had done something irreversible. Her dress shifted softly with each step. Her heels struck the white tile in a rhythm that sounded cold and final, like a sentence being delivered by her own indifference. Behind her, the nurses were calling for a doctor, wiping Mama Ifunania's face and hair, changing the blanket, trying to keep everything from spinning out of control. But some things, once shattered, cannot be saved by a fresh sheet. Dignity, trust, and that final line between a decent human being and someone who has lost her heart. Zainab reached the door. Her hand closed around the handle. For one brief beat before opening it, she paused not out of regret, but as if listening to some distant sound rising from somewhere deep inside herself. A warning too late, a shadow passing over fate, a feeling that there are moments that seem small, private, forgettable, and yet are powerful enough to redirect an entire life. Then she opened the door and walked out, without looking back, as if that room, that woman, and what had just happened were not worth remembering for very long. But in life, it is often the things we think are not worth remembering that the world never forgets. That night, Lagos lit up like it always did. The roads were still jammed with traffic. Upscale restaurants still played music. Glasses still clinked in high-rise rooms overlooking the city, as if nothing in the world were serious enough to make it slow down. And in her apartment, Zainab changed out of her dress, took off her heels, and washed her hands carefully under warm water, as if that alone could rinse away the smell of the hospital, the smell of hot porridge, and the moment that had just taken place in that cold white room. She did not mention it again. Not to anyone, not even to herself. In her mind, what happened that afternoon was only a small emotional slip, a moment of lost control. Something ugly, yes, but something that would sink beneath the surface like so many other private incidents in wealthy families where money, silence, and status were often used to cover the cracks. She believed it would pass, believed the nurses would not dare say much, believed the hospital would not want trouble, believed an old woman paralyzed in a hospital bed could do nothing at all, and above all, she believed that in this world, the ones still standing always had the advantage over those who had already fallen. That is the most dangerous belief arrogant people carry, the belief that silence means powerlessness. But that night, somewhere else in the city, someone opened the hospital security footage. Not publicly, not online, not sent to the press, not thrown to the crowd in exchange for scandal. That video took another path, quieter, more precise, and far more ruthless. It was forwarded to an internal address, known only to the highest tier of power inside the company. No sensational subject line, no long explanation, just one short sentence, cold and heavy enough to make anyone who received it open it immediately. Chairwoman should see this. In some worlds, justice arrives with the knock of the police at the door. In other worlds, it arrives in an unexpected email. The next morning, the Lagos sky was pale and white, washed out after a humid night. Adewale Okoye arrived at the office earlier than usual. He wore a dark blue suit, his tie neatly knotted, his face carrying the usual composure of a man moving steadily along the right career path. On his way into the building, a few employees greeted him with their usual respectful nods. A secretary in the distance gave him a small smile. Everything was running as smoothly as it did on any other morning, until his phone vibrated. The internal message was unusually brief. Boardroom. 800 am. Immediate, no subject, no reason, not a single unnecessary word. Adewale glanced at the time. There were still a few minutes left. But there was something in the use of the word immediate that made his stomach tighten slightly. At this level of power, people did not call emergency meetings unless the issue was serious enough to justify it. And if this were about financial reports, a failed contract, or a decision requiring a signature, it would not have been phrased like that. He stepped into the private elevator. The doors closed. The floor numbers lit up in silence. And for the first time in months, Adewale felt as though he was not moving upward, but being pulled towards something that was already waiting for him. The top floor boardroom was always colder than the other floors, not just because of the air conditioning, but because the kind of power in that room had never been warm. The conference table was long and made of dark wood, polished enough to reflect the overhead lights. The glass walls looked out over Lagos, glowing beneath the early morning sun, and seated at the head of the table were faces that a young executive like Adewale normally saw only during the most critical strategy meetings. Today, all of them were already there. No one was making small talk. No one was flipping through documents. There was no coffee, no polite smiles, none of the softened atmosphere that usually came before a meeting began. There was only silence, silence, heavy enough that when Adwale walked in, he felt as though he had cut through it like a blade through tightly stretched cloth. Sit down, Mur. Okoye. The voice of the man seated in the middle at the head of the table rang out. Calm, polite, but carrying no warmth whatsoever. Adwale pulled out a chair and sat down, back straight, hands resting on the table. His eyes moved across the people facing him, searching for some signal, some clue, some expression that might tell him what this was about. But every face across from him had been controlled too carefully. A woman seated to the left gently pushed a remote forward. The large screen at the end of the room lit up. No company logo, no presentation slides, no revenue chart, just a security camera frame, muted black and white mixed with dull color. A high angle, a timestamp in the corner, and then Adwale saw the hospital room door open. He did not move, but something inside him turned cold instantly. Zainab entered the screen. Clearly, yesterday's dress, yesterday's walk, the porridge container in her hand. No one had to explain anything. His heart had already started beating to a different rhythm, faster, heavier, as though his body recognized collapse before his mind could name it. The boardroom remained soundless. The video continued. Zainab moved toward the hospital bed, leaned down. Her lips moved. There was no sound, but her expression made every silent word feel even sharper. Then came that moment. Her arm swung. The container tipped. The hot porridge splashed straight onto the old woman in the bed, across her face, her hair, her blanket. One nurse rushed forward. Another froze in the doorway. And Zainab turned and walked away as if she had just brushed off something small from her hands. The screen glowed cold. The video was not long, but in that boardroom it felt as long as a sentence being read out line by line. Adwale did not blink. He watched the whole thing. He did not look away, did not ask them to stop, did not defend her. He simply sat there, the color draining from his face, as if someone had reached into his chest and removed a hidden support he had always believed would be there. The video ended. The screen froze on the final frame. Mama Ifunania on the hospital bed, her face covered in porridge, nurses lunging toward her, and Zainab near the door, her back turned. An image that could not be explained away by any version of events that might save anyone. No one spoke at first. The silence afterward was what truly terrified him. Because sometimes, people do not collapse from shouting. They collapse from the silence of those judging them. Adwale swallowed hard. His fingers tightened against the tabletop until his knuckles went white. He had seen negotiations fail, million-dollar deals collapse overnight, executives lose their seats over a single bad decision. But never in his life had he sat in front of a screen and felt his entire life split in two the way it did now. Sir, he began, but his voice came out low and dry, stripped far from its usual calm. The man at the head of the table raised a hand slightly, not to threaten him, but to cut him off. Do you know who that woman is? The question fell onto the table like a thin blade. Adwale looked up. One beat, then another. He did not answer right away. Maybe because the question sounded so absurd that his mind refused to process it. Of course he knew who she was. She was his mother, the woman who gave birth to him, the woman who had been in the hospital for months, the woman the outside world now spoke of only with vague regret about a distant past. But the way the man asked it did not sound as though he were talking about family. It sounded as though he were asking about another identity, another form of power, something Adwale should have known, but had somehow been kept away from all his life. No one rescued him from that silence. In the end, the man at the head of the table answered the question himself, one word at a time, slowly, clearly, leaving no room for escape. She is the founder of this company. The air seemed to leave the room all at once. Adwale did not blink. Maybe he had heard the words clearly. but his mind had not yet caught up enough to believe them. The man continued. His voice did not grow louder, but every word struck directly into Adwale's chest. She is still the largest shareholder. The woman seated to the left gently pulled a file in front of Adwale and turned it toward him. On the first page was an old photograph of Mama, Ifanania younger, sharper, wearing traditional attire, standing in front of a building at its opening ceremony. Beneath it was a title that his eyes needed several seconds to fully absorb. Chairwoman, Mama Ifanania. A silent wave of shock ran down his spine. Memories suddenly burst open in his mind, like drawers that had been locked for years, and then yanked wide at once. The late-night phone calls his mother used to receive when he was a child. The older men who came to the house and changed their tone the moment she entered. Conversations cut short whenever he asked about her work in the past. The years after the family crisis, when his father always said, "That's all in the past," while his mother stayed silent as if silence were the only thing she still had left to protect. He had grown up in the shadow of an enormous truth, and had never once seen it clearly. And now that truth had not come to him in the arms of family, not through a gentle explanation, but here in this cold boardroom, before the highest power in the company, with a video showing that his wife had humiliated the very woman who built the foundation beneath his own feet. Not just his mother, not just a helpless patient, but the founder, the one who laid the first stone, the name that had never disappeared from the structure of power, even after vanishing from public view. In truly powerful companies, there are people who no longer need to sit at the conference table every day, because the table itself exists because of their decisions. Adwale felt the palms of his hands turn ice cold. Only then did he understand why doors had always opened for him so quickly, why there were times he thought he was merely good enough, yet opportunity still came to him as if it had already been prepared. Why his name, despite his youth, was always spoken with a degree of caution greater than talent alone could explain. It was not because he was not capable, but because behind him, from the very beginning, stood a legacy no one had ever fully told him about. A silent power, a name forgotten on the surface, but never erased from the core, and Zainab, the woman who, just the night before, believed she had poured out her anger onto a worthless burden, had in truth thrown hot porridge onto the face of the woman holding part of the soul of the very empire where her husband had placed his future. Adwale's collapse did not come with tears. It did not come with any dramatic movement. It came when his eyes slowly dropped to the table, as though for the first time in his life, he no longer had the strength to look straight ahead. Because there are truths that, once revealed, do more than shock a person. They force them to re-examine their entire life and realize they may never have understood what real. And in that bright, cold boardroom among expressionless faces, files, screens, and power, Adwale came to understand something far too late. A family does not fall apart at the moment a secret is hidden. It falls apart at the moment that secret steps into the light, and no one is strong enough to pretend they never saw it. Before Zainab could even understand what was happening, the world she believed was solid began cracking from the inside. There was no loud explosion, no chaos. No one came knocking at her door to announce a disaster. Everything happened in the most dangerous way, quietly and precisely. That morning, while Zainab was still sitting in front of the mirror, adjusting her makeup as usual, her phone began to vibrate. One message, then three. Not from close friends, not from family, but from people in the social circle she had always been so proud to belong to. The people who used to invite her to parties, who used to laugh with her, who used to say her name with soft respect. Today, they didn't call. They only texted. Short, cold. Is this true? Zainab, what happened? I just saw something. She frowned. She didn't understand. She didn't want to understand. She opened one of the messages. There was a video attached. No title. No explanation, just a file. And the moment she tapped it, her world began to break apart. A familiar frame, the hospital room, the dress she wore yesterday. It was her. No hidden angle, no editing, not a single detail missing. She watched herself, walk toward the bed, lean down, say something, and then throw the porridge straight at her. That moment appeared on the small screen of her phone, but it carried the weight of an entire building collapsing onto her. She stopped the video, opened it again, stopped it, opened it one more time, as if hoping that if she watched it enough times, it would turn into something else, but it didn't. It was the truth. Bare, undeniable, impossible to twist, impossible to hide. And the most terrifying part, it wasn't online. No comments, no public shares, no hashtags, just private messages, passed from one person to another, inside a circle she understood better than anyone. The very place where reputations are built, and also where they are killed the fastest. Zainab stood up. The chair behind her tipped back slightly, but she didn't notice. Her heart was pounding, not from simple fear, but because, for the first time in her life, she was feeling something she had only ever watched happen to other people. Loss of control. She called Adwale. No answer. She called again. Still nothing. The third time, his phone was off. A cold emptiness ran down her spine, because Adwale had never done that. Never. Not even on his busiest days. Not even during his most important meetings. He always answered. Always stayed in control. Always remained reachable. But today, he had disappeared, not from the company, but from her reach. On the other side of the city, inside the building where power had no need to show itself in order to exist, a decision had already been made. Not announced publicly. No press conference. No explanation required. A short internal email was sent out. Mr. Adwale Okoye is temporarily relieved of all active duties, pending further review. No long justification. No details. Just enough for everyone who needed to know to understand. And in the hallways where people always lowered their voices when speaking about real power, the name Zainab Bello began to appear. No one shouted. No one accused her in public. But the half-finished sentences, the exchanged glances, the conversations that stopped the moment a third person approached. That is how reputations are torn apart in that world. Not loudly, but with no way back. That afternoon, Adwale came home. The door opened slowly. No hurried footsteps. No explosion of anger like the kind people imagine in stories. He entered like a man who had just come back from somewhere very far away and had brought nothing back with him. Zainab stood in the middle of the living room. She was no longer sitting at the mirror, no longer fixing anything. Her phone was still in her hand, its screen dark. She looked at him. She wanted to say something, an explanation, a denial, an apology, but everything she had always been good at, words, confidence, the ability to turn a situation in her favor, vanished. Adwale did not look around. He did not ask whether she had eaten. He did not ask how her day had been. He set his keys down on the table, then looked straight at her. There was no rage in his eyes, no noise, but they were colder than any anger she had ever seen. "What did you do to my mother?" The question fell softly, but so heavily that the air in the room seemed to tighten. Zainab opened her mouth. No sound came out. She wanted to say it had only been a moment, wanted to say she hadn't thought that far ahead, wanted to say she didn't know, wanted to say she hadn't understood it would go this far. But every one of those words, standing in front of the truth, became meaningless, because the real problem was not that she didn't know the consequences. It was that she had not valued the person in front of her enough not to do it. And that is not something words can fix. Adwale looked at her for one more second, then two. In his eyes, something had shattered. Not his career, not his reputation, but his trust. The thing that had once made him believe this woman could walk through anything with him. Now, she was the one who had pushed him down, not with a scheme, but with contempt. "Do you know who she is?" He asked again, his voice still low, but each word sounding as if it had been forced out of his chest. Zainab shook her head very slightly, slowly, weakly. For the first time in her life, she was no longer sure what kind of ground she was standing on. Adewale laughed. A laugh with no joy in it. I didn't know either. That answer made her freeze. Not until this morning. He stepped closer. Not threatening. Not aggressive. Just close enough to make clear that the space between them was no longer what it used to be. The woman you threw porridge in the face of. He paused. One beat. Is the founder of my company. Zainab stopped breathing. Did not blink. Did not move. She is still the most powerful person there. Each word pulled down another piece of the world she had built. She is the reason, in one way or another, that everything I have today even began. And then, he said the final sentence. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with enough force to end everything. She is my mother. An obvious truth. But now it meant something entirely different. No longer just an old woman lying in a hospital bed. No longer a burden. No longer a forgotten name from the past. But the most powerful person she had ever chosen to underestimate. Zainab took a step back. Not because anyone pushed her, but because that realization alone made her legs unsteady. Everything she had once believed, that power belonged to the present, that value belonged to those who could still perform, that the weak no longer had influence, collapsed. Not one piece remained intact. And in that moment, Zainab understood something she should have known long ago. There are people who, even while lying silent, are still the foundation of the entire world you are standing on. And when you choose to look down on them, you are not only humiliating a human being, you are erasing your own place in the world with your own hands. The room fell silent. No one said anything else. Nothing else needed to be said. Because some prices come with no warning, no chance to negotiate. And by the time you realize you have to pay them, it is already too late. A few days later, Zainab returned to the hospital. But the woman who stepped out of the car that day no longer looked like the one who had once less place to the cold sound of her heels and eyes without hesitation. She was not wearing high heels. She was not carrying an expensive handbag. The flawless makeup that once made people turn and stare was gone. The dress she wore was so simple that if anyone had seen her at the lavish parties of Lagos, they might not have recognized her right away. Her hair was tied neatly back. Her face looked pale. Her eyes were exhausted. And for the first time in many years, Zainab walked like someone who no longer knew where she belonged. The hospital was still the same white walls, the same antiseptic smell slipping into every breath, the same sound of carts rolling down the long hallway, the steady hum of the air conditioner overhead, the nurses lowering their voices as if in this place, any loud sound became a form of disrespect. But to Zainab, everything had changed. Before, she hated this place because it made her uncomfortable. Today, she feared it, because it held on to the cruelest version of herself. Every step toward that room felt like a step backward into a memory she had tried to bury for days. The image of the porridge container, the hot splash cutting through the air, the old woman's face covered in humiliation, the stunned eyes of the nurse, and worse than all of it, the moment Adewale stood in the living room and asked her, in a voice so quiet it turned cold, "What did you do to my mother?" From that day on, their house was no longer a home. It became a place too large for two people who no longer knew how to speak to each other. Adewale did not yell. He did not break things. He did not use the bitter words many other men might have used to pour out their anger. He simply went silent. And there are silences more painful than any insult. He moved into his office to sleep. They no longer shared meals. The everyday questions disappeared. No more "Are you tired?" No more "The doctor said you need more rest." No more hand on her shoulder when she walked slowly through the living room with the heavy weight of her pregnancy. Love does not leave with a loud sound. It leaves by slowly withdrawing warmth from the things that once felt ordinary. Zainab lived in that house for days, as if she were living inside the echo of herself. Everywhere she went, She saw the consequences of one act she had once believed was only a brief lapse in control. Hardly anyone texted her anymore, except for a few cold check-ins from relatives. Invitations vanished. People who used to be close were suddenly busy. Those who once spoke to her with admiration now replied in clipped, distant messages. Her reputation did not explode. It dissolved, quietly, like sugar dropped into hot water, leaving no trace of its former shape. And then, in the middle of all that collapse, one thought kept growing inside her. Not to save her reputation, not to reclaim her position, but something far simpler and far more painful. She had to go back, not because she deserved forgiveness, but because there are mistakes that, if you do not find the courage to stand in front of them, you will never be able to look at yourself again. She stood outside the hospital room for a long time before opening the door. Her hand rested on the handle, but she could not turn it right away. For the first time, Zainab understood what it meant to fear a door, not because danger was behind it, but because truth was. At last, she pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was quieter than she remembered. The afternoon light slanted through the window, thin and pale, spreading across the white blanket in a nearly transparent wash. The heart monitor still beeped steadily. A small vase of flowers sat at the corner of the table, a few petals already beginning to soften and droop. There was no crowd, no doctor, no nurse standing close to the bed at that moment. Only Mama Efunanya. She lay there thinner, quieter, but still carrying that strange presence of someone illness had never fully erased from this world. Zainab froze. Her throat tightened shut. All the words she had prepared on the way there suddenly disappeared. "I am sorry, I was wrong. Please look at me. Please say something." Not one of them could come out, because when a person truly understands what they have done, words usually arrive too late. She stepped closer. Slowly, very slowly. There were no sharp heels this time. Only footsteps, so soft they were nearly silent. She stopped at the foot of the bed, both hands clasped in front of her stomach, as if holding herself upright. This time, she did not dare touch her. She did not dare adjust the blanket. She did not dare pull up a chair and sit down. She did not dare give herself the right to enter that woman's space one more time. She only stood there, silent, like someone standing in front of a place that had once burned to the ground, unsure whether she still had the right to call it home. Mama Efunanya knew someone had entered. It showed in the faintest blink and the slight shift in her breathing, but she did not turn her head, not like before. She did not look toward the door. She did not follow Zainab's movements, as if still hoping to find some trace of kindness beneath her coldness. Her gaze stayed fixed on the window, on the pale afternoon sky outside, on somewhere farther than this room, farther than this hospital, farther even than the humiliation she had silently endured a few days earlier, as though the woman standing behind her now no longer belonged in her world. Zainab looked at the side of her mother-in-law's face, an aging profile, wrinkles deeper beneath the afternoon light, lips slightly dry, silver hair neatly brushed, and that calmness hurt her more than blame ever could, because if Mama Efunanya had cried, perhaps Zainab would have felt there was still a chance. If she had been angry, perhaps Zainab would have felt she still existed in her emotions. If she had looked straight at her with contempt, perhaps Zainab would have known she was at least being judged. But no, Mama Efunanya did nothing at all. She simply did not look, and that was the final sentence. Some wounds do not end with anger. They end with the withdrawal of the heart, with the moment someone realizes that keeping your image in their life only causes more pain. So they set you down the way one sets down something broken beyond repair. Zainab felt her legs go cold. She wanted to say mother, wanted to fall to her knees, wanted to say that she understood now, that she had not slept for days, that for the first time in her life, she understood power did not belong to the loudest, the most beautiful, or the one standing beneath the brightest lights, that there are people who, even while lying in a hospital bed, Stand taller than those who still have full use of their bodies, but have lost their humanity. But the word mother caught in her throat and became something too heavy to force out. In the end, all she managed to say was one small sentence. I am sorry. Her voice was thin, almost breaking. It fell into the room and disappeared. No one answered. Only the sound of the heart monitor. Beep, beep, steady. Cold if time were still moving forward, no matter where a human heart had just broken. Zainab lowered her head. Tears began to fall. Not violently, not loudly, just slow drops landing on the back of her hand, as though even her tears had arrived too late. All her life, she had believed many things could be repaired with the right words at the right time, with the right appearance, with control, with the ability to make everything look fine. But now, standing before a woman who could no longer be bothered to look at her, she understood a truth no school ever teaches. Not every mistake is forgiven simply because you finally realize you were wrong. Some doors, once closed, do not open again just because you want them to. Some eyes, once they turn away, do so because they are too tired to place their trust in you one more time. A few minutes passed, or longer. Zainab could not tell. Time in that room did not move like a clock. It moved like a wound being pulled open. Then the door behind her opened softly. Adewale walked in. He stopped at the doorway when he saw her standing there. Not surprised. Maybe he had known she would come eventually. Or maybe he had guessed it. Because when people lose everything, they often return to the place where the tragedy began, as if it were the only way left to face themselves. He said nothing to Zainab. He did not tell her to leave. He walked to the bedside and gently adjusted one corner of the blanket for his mother. That small gesture made Zainab's heart tighten, not because it was grand, but because it revealed something she had never understood. Real love is sometimes nothing more than repeating gentle acts, even when the other person no longer has the strength to respond. Amal Ifanania still did not look at Zainab, but when Adewale stood beside her, her eyes softened very slightly. Just a tiny change, so small an outsider might not have noticed. But Zainab saw it, and in that moment, she understood the most painful truth of all. It was not that Mama Ifunania had lost the ability to feel. It was that she had chosen not to give that part of herself to Zainab anymore. Adewale straightened. Only then did he turn to look at his wife. His eyes no longer carried the shock they had held days before. They were quieter now, more tired, older, as if in only a few days he had already lived through too many years. The doctor said my mother needs peace, he said. That was all. Not excessively cold, not harsh, but the distance in his voice was so clear it did not need a name. Zainab nodded. She wanted to say more. Wanted to ask whether there was any way to repair any of this. Wanted to know whether there was anything left between them. But she understood that this was no longer the moment to try to hold on to anything for herself. She looked at Mama Ifunania one last time. The woman she had once seen as a burden, once believed had no value left, once humiliated at her most vulnerable moment, now lying there, quietly, without needing to say a single word, and still teaching her the greatest lesson of her life, that dignity does not disappear just because the body grows weak, that real power is not always on display, that some people, while they are still beside us, seem ordinary and guaranteed, until their eyes turn away, and only then do we understand what we have lost. Zainab stepped back, one step at a time, not turning away immediately, as if still waiting for some small miracle, a glance, a movement, a sign that she had not completely become a stranger. But there was nothing. Mama Ifunania kept looking out the window, at the fading afternoon light beyond the glass, as though somewhere beyond that frame, some part of the old world, still remained a world of dignity, memory, and affections that should never have been tested by cruelty. Zainab opened the door and walked out. The hallway was still white, still long, still cold. But when the door closed behind her, she knew that something in her life had truly closed with it. Not the marriage in that exact moment, not her reputation, not her status, but the final illusion that a person can wound someone to the deepest point and then restore everything with a single apology. Because the truth always finds a way. It may move slowly. It may move silently. It may hide in white rooms, in unnoticed security footage, in the eyes of someone no longer strong enough to speak. But sooner or later, it still steps into the light. And when it does not only expose the one who was wrong, it also reveals who truly has value. When every outward appearance collapses, there are people who are mistaken for weak simply because they lie still. But the truth is, some people, even when they can no longer stand, still stand taller than an entire world full of arrogance. And there are others who only understand after life knocks them down that the most dangerous loss is not poverty, not illness, not power slipping away, but losing the heart of someone who once considered you family. If this story touched you, remember one thing. Never measure a person's value by the moment they are at their weakest, because today they may be lying silently before you, but they may still be the invisible foundation of the very world you are standing on. Where are you watching from? Leave your country or city in the comments below, so we can see where this story has reached hearts around the world. And don't forget to subscribe and stay with us through the next stories, because sometimes just one story is enough to change the way we treat people for the rest of our lives.